Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I'm your librarian, Katrina, and on Sundays I do a thing called Books and Booze where I review a book and mix up a cocktail. It is the last Sunday of the month, so it's time for the Nether President. This week, our country's 40th President, Ronald Reagan, making this week's book Reagan, The Life by H.W. Brands. The accompanying cocktail is an orange blossom, which is equal parts gin and orange juice, and was even named in the book. Apparently, that when Reagan was having an informal meeting with congressional leaders about cutting spending, everyone was drinking. It was kind of social, and Reagan wasn't much of a drinker, but this was what he would drink, would be an orange blossom. And this was all going well until Tip O'Neill suddenly got pissed about not wanting to cut something, because the Democrats like to spend. At least they did back then. Now it's everybody likes to spend. But anyways, let's do this. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois on February 6, 1911, to Jack and Nellie Reagan, who had one son before Reagan, Neil. The family was poor. They kind of bounced around various towns in Illinois until finally settling in Dixon, Illinois when Reagan was 10, and that's where they would live up until he left for college. I'm going to do 2 ounces each to start. It's equal parts. It should be pretty straightforward. Now, during the Carter book, right, the author broadly hinted that anybody who's Republican, up to and including Reagan, were racist because they are Republicans. Well, Jack Reagan was by no means perfect. I mean, he was an alcoholic. It's largely because of his alcoholism that Reagan himself rarely drank. But he was certainly not a racist, and he did not raise his sons to be racist. In fact, he refused to take the family to see Birth of the Nation, which is the D.W. Griffith film that Woodrow Wilson, famous Democrat, showed in the White House. It made heroes out of the Klan. Yes, the KKK. And he's like, no, we're not going to go see that. That's garbage. It's propaganda. We're not going to go do that. And there was one time when Jack was traveling for work, and he pulled into a hotel. And when the hotel said something about, don't worry, our rooms are totally clean, we don't rent to Jews, he left. Because he's like, if you're not going to rent to Jews, it's not going to be long before you refuse to rent to me. I'm Catholic. He was Irish Catholic. And he knew that racism is kissing cousins with hating everybody, so he refused. And he instilled those values in his kids. In fact, the more I read this book, the more bitter and sour Peter Bourne, the author of the Carter book, seemed. It seems like he was really just pissed that his guy lost in 1980. Back to this book. Actually, let me shake this up and then we'll come back to this book. So Reagan was kind of a socially awkward kid. I mean, his brother Neil was the sports star and, the really good in class and everybody loved him. But Reagan was kind of just this socially awkward kid. He didn't really fit in anywhere. But his mom one time talked him into doing a church play or church recital or something, and he kind of found his voice as an actor. And he was like 10 when this happened. And that's a course that he wanted to follow from that point on. He wanted to be an actor. He wanted to go into productions. After high school, he went to Eureka College, following his high school crush, Margaret Cleaver, to this location. It's unclear if they dated or if they were just friends, but he went to Eureka College because she went to Eureka College. Regardless, their relationship did not survive college, and after they graduated, they each went their separate ways. Now, he graduated in 1932, because he did 4 years at Eureka College, went in 1928, so that's the height of the Depression, and that made the job market tough. I mean, one might think he'd immediately head to Hollywood, trying, searching that big dream, but he wanted to be an actor, but he was pragmatic and a realist, and he knew that those are long odds, right? Anybody trying to be big in Hollywood are long odds. So he was cautious, and he wasn't going to make that leap to a cross-country move without some chance of success. So he started pounding the pavement locally, looking for a job in radio, and he found one. He walked into station WOC in Davenport, Iowa, just after they had filled a position they'd advertised for. And kind of in a fit of frustration, Reagan said, quote, "How the hell can you be a good sports announcer if you can't even get a job at a radio station?" And the passion with which he said this kind of spoke to the station manager, who asked him to report on a fake game. Now, in the days before televised sports, the ability to make a game come alive with your voice was invaluable. And so Reagan reported on a college football game he had played in, and got a short-term contract, which eventually leveraged into a steady-paying job. And he was a sports radio announcer. Yep, it's gin and orange juice. It's okay. It's gin and orange juice. It's a twist on a screwdriver. Get it? Twist on a screwdriver, right? Now, eventually, he talked the station into sending him out to California to report on the White Sox winter training. And during a rainy day in April of 1937, he went out there 3 years in a row, but he was working, right? He couldn't just slip away until the weather cooperated one year, and it was raining. So there was no practice game. So he went into Hollywood and met with a former radio employee whose contact information he had, Joy Hodges. And Joy had moved out to Hollywood to try and make it herself. And she had a few bit parts, but mostly she was singing in a lounge band. But after she saw what he looked like without the glasses that he wore for nearsightedness, because he was extremely nearsighted, she set up an appointment with Bill Micklejohn, who set up an appointment with Max Arno at Warner Brothers, who set up a screen test and then showed that screen test to Jack Warner. So boom, 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 all the little dominoes lined up. And while all this worked its way through the Hollywood system, Reagan, pragmatic as ever, returned to Iowa and his short paycheck because he needed something concrete before he was just going to upend and move his life to Hollywood. And he was back at the radio when he received a contract offer of $200 a week from Warner Brothers, which is about $4,300 per week in today's currency. And he took the contract and permanently moved out to California. And that's basically where he lived up until he became president, and then again after presidency. Now, once in Hollywood, he was cast in many B-roll films. Now, basically, way back in the day, Hollywood churned out movies that are really fast-paced. I mean, they turn them out fast now, but now you got all these, not just the edits, but the Technicolor, the text cuts and the CGI and everything else. They were fast back then. And the B-movies were the opening act for the big-name featured films on double features. And this is how Hollywood was making a lot of money, is you'd buy tickets for a double feature, you'd see the B-movie, you'd see the A-list movie. And Reagan was a B-movie actor, and he might have made the leap to featured films, but World War II interrupted life at this point. Always thinking ahead, Reagan actually enlisted with the Army Reserve's cavalry unit because the cavalry would teach him to ride horses. And that's a skill he thought, hey, I could bring that back to Hollywood after the war and maybe make some westerns. Unfortunately, he was so incredibly nearsighted that active duty in combat was just not going to happen. They were actually worried he might end up shooting his own people by mistake because he just could not see without glasses, not even a little bit. So instead, he was made a public relations officer for the military, and Warner Brothers began churning out propaganda films starring Reagan. And so he became the voice and face of what America was doing to fight evil. And this definitely worked in his favor during his later political career. It's a long review, so let's get through this. He married his first wife, Jane Wyman, on January 26, 1940, and the couple had 3 children together. They had Maureen and Christine were their birth daughters, and then they adopted Michael. Now, Michael was the middle child here. Christine was born premature and died within a day of birth, and the couple divorced pretty much right after that. I think Jane filed for divorce in 1948, and they were divorced a year later in July of 1949. But it was more or less amicable. I mean, he was hurt, sure, who wouldn't be, but she never had anything unkind to say about him and spoke fondly of him about his presidency and his life when he died. Incidentally, this would make him the first president who had been divorced to sit in the Oval Office. Now, post-war, his movie career fizzled. All right, it really did. He wasn't going anywhere, but he found meaning and additional work by stepping into leadership of the Screen Actors Guild, for which he served as president from March of 1947 until 1952, then again from 1959 to 1960. Now, as president of SAG, he did testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee about communist takeovers in Hollywood. Now, I don't think he named names during the open forum that were the committee or the House Un-American Activities Committees. He did in private conversation to the FBI, at least this is what my understanding is, but other than speaking about the activities which were communistic in nature, he didn't really say much to Congress other than, yes, there does appear to be an infiltration and takeover of Hollywood. Now, it was while he was working the president of SAG in the He met Nancy not long after, 49. So he met, in November of 1949, he met Nancy. Now, Nancy Davis was born Anne Frances Robbins. She was just called Nancy, and she was, I think, legally adopted by her stepfather, which gave her the last name Davis. They met in November of 49, and they dated for a few years. They actually dated multiple people. She dated, I want to say Clark Gable and, a couple of other movie stars. But she really set her sights on Reagan. She was very attractive to him and really liked him. He was gun shy. He was worried about getting hurt again, so he dated multiple women. And this all happened until they got married March 4th, 1952. And they also had 2 children, the first of which, Patricia Ann Reagan, a.k.a. Patty Davis, was born October 21st, 1952. So less than usual 9 months. She was not premature. So there is some speculation that they got married because Nancy got pregnant. Not to say he didn't love her. He absolutely adored Nancy, and she adored him. In fact, after they got married, basically she made her life about Reagan and making sure that he succeeded no matter what. From that perspective, she was the very quintessential 1950s bride and an absolutely adept political wife. Now, his movie career may have fizzled, but his Hollywood career jumped to the small screen when he signed on to host General Electric Theater, which he did from their first show, which aired July 9th, 1953, until the show ended in 1962. So for 9 years, he was the host of General Electric Theater. And there was some political tension that came in there. He started to really find his opinion about big government there. In fact, there's some indications that the show itself may have been canceled over politics because Reagan was speaking out more and more against big government, which included like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was one of Roosevelt's big things. The Kennedy clan may have made some noise about it. Regardless, he was fired, but amicably, from General Electric, and the show itself was canceled. And at this point, his entertainment career is effectively over. He didn't go into any more acting, but it was basically at a good time. He had enough money saved up that he could enter a second career, and the one for which he is best known, politics. And he entered the political arena on a national stage after giving a campaign speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964. His speech, famously known as his A Time for Choosing speech, did not get Goldwater elected, but it did launch Reagan into national prominence as a Republican to watch. And rather than join the national politicians, Reagan, he could have run for Congress or Senate. He didn't do that. He went for a local executive position, becoming governor of California in 1967, in which position he served until 1975, when he declined to run in the 74 election. So the 74 election happened, the new governor was sworn in 75, and he stepped down. He did make a stab for the presidential nominee in 1976, but lost the nomination to Ford, who was the sitting president, so it was much easier for him to make a good impression. And, of course, Ford lost to Carter. But Reagan kind of bided his time, and he won the nomination for the 1980 presidential election, winning in an absolute blood-soaked gore bath. Oh, my God. He won 46 out of 50 states, 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49, and was sworn in as our 40th president, January 20th, 1981. Oh my God. And holy shit. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, and I have peripheral memories of some of this because I was a kid. I watched cartoons, not the evening news. But the 80s were freaking wild, man. Oh my God.
In the 80s, there was Cold War drama.
He inherited a country that was drowning in inflation. I mean, it's the inflation more than anything that lost Carter the election. Not because, 98% of the country woke up and decided to be racist, which is what... I'm really pissed about the Carter book now. That author, fuck, man, keep your own opinion out. Just report the straight facts. Anyways, it was drowning in inflation. Russia was mad at us again because of Carter's meddling with the earlier agreed-upon treaty. There were still Americans being held hostage in Iran. We had airplanes that were taken by terrorists. Airplanes just shot up, straight up blown out of the sky, right? I mean, holy shit. Commercial airlines blown up by Russian military personnel. There were communists poised to take over Nicaragua, and Reagan was shot barely 2 months into his presidency. Crazy times. So let's kind of start with Iran on this one. In the Carter book, the author had hinted that Vice President Bush had used his CIA contacts to broker a back alley deal to get the hostages released after the election to make Carter look bad. Brands addresses this, and this says basically that's just sour grapes on the part of author Peter Bourne. Brands addressed the allegation in this book, and basically the bargainers, the ones who allegedly made these deals, like their locations have been accounted for, and there was nowhere and no time where they would have been in a position to make such a deal. I mean, even one of them was even missing his passports. Okay, so they couldn't verify the travel stamps, but they had other journals and diary entries that accounted for his whereabouts. Peter Bourne failed to mention in his book on that Congress actually did conduct an investigation into these allegations, because brokering such a backdoor deal is actually a felony and a violation of federal law. I think that Bourne just didn't want to admit what really happened. Iran intensely disliked Carter. They disliked him. Brands actually floats a theory as to why they disliked him. I don't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, they just really disliked Carter. Apparently they thought he was a bit of a meddler. Once they were sure he was really out of office, meaning he had in fact, stepped down and Reagan was sworn in, they released the hostages as an act of goodwill towards the new administrator, aka President Reagan. The Iran hostage situation, believe it or not, is what sets the stage for the Iran-Contra scandal that would rock the nation in 1987. How so? Well, Reagan did not ever want to be in Carter's position of having to tell American citizens that he could not protect them. To add a word here. And when 7 Americans in Lebanon were taken hostage by Hezbollah, Reagan kept it more or less quiet, but he became desperate to get them back. Like, truly desperate. And that's kind of one half of the scandal. The other half occurred 8,300 miles away in Nicaragua, where the left-leaning Sandinistas, who were brutal and awful, but they were Carter's buddies. Carter got along with the Sandinistas. They had taken over the government. And Reagan did not want another Russian satellite communist state like Cuba sitting near our southern border. So while he was all about lowering taxes and slashing government spending, he wanted to slash social programs while keeping a robust defense budget up. So he wanted to fund the Contras who were fighting the Sandinistas, but Congress said no. And in 1982, they passed the Boland Amendment, which prohibited the CIA from selling arms to the Contras, or providing any aid to the Contras, frankly. They're like, the Contras are on their own. We'll send money to kind of hold the line at El Salvador, but the Contras are on their own in Nicaragua. We're going to circle back to Iran-Contra after covering some of the other stuff that happened, because this was like a 6-year process going on here. So all this budget slashing occurred early in Reagan's first term, and it started to bear fruit in 1983, which had his 1984 re-election return even more brutal results. 49 states went to Reagan, 525 electoral votes. I think his opponent, Walter Mondale, got like 10 electoral votes. Minnesota? Michigan? He won one state. And talk about a brutal referendum on what the Democrats were dishing out right then, man. All right, so going back to his first term, March 30th, 1981, while leaving a speech, he was shot by John Hinckley. Now, they didn't even realize he had been hit at first. The wounds to James Brady, Thomas Delahanty, and Tim McCarthy were much more obvious and more severe. I mean, all they knew is they heard the shots. They shoved Reagan into, his presidential limousine. Didn't realize until they were driving away that he had in fact been shot, and drove him to a hospital, like immediately, where he underwent emergency surgery. And obviously he lived, but Nancy went a little off her rocker as a result. I get it. Don't get me wrong. Having someone try to shoot your husband to impress an actress, and no joke, this was not a political assassination attempt. John Hinckley was trying to impress Jodie Foster. Talk about bonkers. And that's going to have an impact. It's going to make you go a little on the nutso side, right? I mean, trying to kill Reagan because... I might actually have to make another one. Trying to kill Reagan... Maybe I shouldn't make another one. My brain's pickling. Trying to kill Reagan because you don't like him slashing a social program, because, you think we should keep high welfare rolls, fine. Trying to kill him because you're trying to impress somebody, that is absolutely fucking bonkers. I mean, she goes off her rocker. I get it. But she basically starts checking everything with her astrologer. That's not a joke. She definitely believed in astrology, and she ran all important meetings and everything that Reagan was going to do. If it was a big thing, like before meeting with Gorbachev or addressing Congress, she'd check her astrologer, and the chief of staff was required to basically run the president's schedule past this astrologer, one Joan Quigley in San Francisco. I can only imagine what an absolute security nightmare this must have been for the Secret Service. So he recovers from his assassination attempt, and then a few months later, in August of 1981, yeah, nuts, the air traffic controllers went on strike. They wanted more money, which I get. I mean, that's one of the advantages of working for a union, is that the unions will negotiate a higher pay for their people to combat inflation. No joke. All right? Which is great, except that the pay doesn't recede when the inflation ends, so the unions remain very high paid, and it makes people not want to work with unions. Unions take an awful lot for, you know what? That's not the story of this book. Focus back. Focus. Focus. So, unfortunately, air traffic controllers are federal employees. They fall under the Federal Aviation Administration, and federal employees have to sign a contract agreeing not to strike. Fun fact, when we don't meet our budget, when we shut down the government, there are federal employees who are required to keep working even though they're not getting paid. Like prison guards. All those federal correctional facilities, they have to remain staffed. So even though they're not getting paid, they're required to work, and they're not allowed to strike. What happens if they do strike? Well, Reagan cited Calvin Coolidge when he said government employees are not allowed to strike to the detriment of the people they serve. That's what Coolidge said when the police department in Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, went on strike. He's like, no, you're not, and he fired them. Reagan did the same thing. He straight up fired the air traffic controllers who did not report for duty as required. Why don't they strike when they're not getting a paycheck, our federal employees? Fun fact, when you are fired from the federal government, you are precluded from obtaining other federal work for 3 years. So if you go on strike, get fired, it's going to throw a real damper in your retirement plans if you're not able to work for 3 years. Especially when air traffic control is a highly specialized field. So all those who went on strike, life was not easy for them from that point forward. Action meet consequences. And Reagan felt for them. He actually did. All right, he felt that they had been led astray by their union leaders. But they also made the choice, right? Because not everybody went on strike. Some broke through the picket lines, went to work. But Reagan did try to waive the 3-year no hire requirement to get them into other federal positions. The book does not say if he was able to politic that into reality. In 1983, I don't remember exactly the date, America did fly a spy plane over the Soviet Union. This made the Soviets nervous. And when South Korea Airlines Flight 007 basically got lost, they didn't realize they were flying in and out of Soviet airspace. The Soviets freaked out, thought it might be another American spy plane, and rather than hailing the airline and saying, hey, do you know where you're going? They straight up shot it out of the sky. Straight up. Full flight. September 1st, 1983, the flight had 61 U.S. passengers, including a congressman from Georgia, Representative Lawrence McDonald. Congressman from Georgia, it's supposed to say Georgia. Reagan condemned this as a heinous act, right? I mean, who shoots down a civilian airliner? But there really wasn't much more that could be done without escalating to full warfare, which he didn't want to do, right? They both had nukes. Nobody wants to be responsible for kicking off a nuclear war. What he did want was to find an effective way to defend America no matter how far away the shot came from. And from this desire came the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, better known as Star Wars. Not the George Lucas Star Wars, obviously. They just called it that because it was an ironic name, right? Basically, he wanted to set up space guns that would shoot down anything that fired at America. Billions were poured down this drain from a safe distance of 40 years later. It's easy to see how crazy this idea was. But he introduced the idea in March of '83, and it would become a major sticking point in his negotiations with the Soviets. Those negotiations would not begin until 1985, when Gorbachev was made Secretary General of the Soviet Union, largely because Reagan, boy, I have a misspelling there, just could not find common ground with any of Gorbachev's predecessors. You had Konstantin Chernenko, Yuri Andropov. They both would die, and George Bush would go to their funerals because that's what you did, right? When you're the president, unless you personally know them, you don't go to the funeral, but you do send an emissary, in this case, George W. Bush. I think he made a joke to Gorbachev at Andropov funeral? At one of their funerals, he's like, we got to quit meeting like this. But Gorbachev, Reagan and Gorbachev met several times, first in Geneva, later in Reykjavik, to discuss disarmament. Now, the Reykjavik one was a big one because it was a business meeting between essentially the top CEOs of both nations, right? You have Reagan as the CEO of America, Gorbachev as the CEO of the USSR. It was not like a months ahead of planning. Like, Gorbachev just called him up and said, hey, let's meet halfway. And they met in Reykjavik to discuss disarmament. Now, the meeting in Geneva, the meeting in Reykjavik, both times they came to absolutely nothing because Reagan refused to call a halt to field testing SDI, even though there was literally no indication that SDI would ever work, even if it moved beyond laboratory testing into actual field tests. In point of fact, the author says at one point that, like at Reykjavik, they came very close to an agreement, right? Just that Gorbachev was like, can you hold off doing field tests for 10 years while we do this, while we run out this armed treaty? Another treaty they were all sworn to, like, we're not going to withdraw from this treaty, we're both going to see this treaty out, just don't field test for 10 years. And Reagan's like, can't do it, not going to make that promise, even though they were a minimum of 10 years out from even being able to do field tests. It became very frustrating to read because you're like, Reagan, I mean, okay, I had the advantage of being, 40 years hindsight and going, you're a dumbass for not just agreeing to this and making it a historic treaty. But in the moment, he genuinely believed this was the way to keep America safe. So he refused to budge on it, and the negotiations led nowhere. Until 1987, they did meet in Washington, D.C. They brokered a massive disarmament deal. Both sides agreed to get rid of nuclear stockpiles and intermediary weapons, and the SDI was left intact. And then mothballed in 1993 or thereabouts when Clinton renamed it to something else. That's a future book issue. Okay, I've kind of rambled on. We're at 5 pages on this review, so let me round out Iran-Contra here, and then I'll kind of sum up. We have 7 Americans being held hostage by Hezbollah. Iran agreed to talk to Hezbollah in exchange for TOW missiles. Basically, it became a thing to trade X number of missiles per hostage. And this got us back, I think, 2 hostages. We didn't even get back all the hostages we were negotiating for. Seriously, our hostage negotiators, if they're not already dead, they should have been fired back then. Like, what the hell? But several members of the intel community, most notably Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and National Security Advisor John Poindexter, arranged to continue to sell TOW missiles and other armament bits and pieces, repair pieces, to Iran. And then they funneled the proceeds of those sales to the Contras in Nicaragua. All of this without knowledge or consent of Congress. And in fact, in direct violation of the Boland Amendment, which said we're not allowed to help the Contras. Now, at first they did this through Israel. However, Israel eventually got tired of being the middleman and just said, make your own sales. Do this yourself. We're out. We don't need to be a part of this. And this was all uncovered in November of 1986 when journalists in America noticed a small article in an Arabic newspaper alleging that the United States had been trading missiles for hostages in Iran. And that was it. This tiny article in a foreign print newspaper blew open a massive story in America. Now, Reagan, I don't think he actually knew anything about this, and the author doesn't either. And a lot of the written documentation supports that Reagan probably didn't actually know this was going on. Like, he made his wishes known. He wanted to support the Contras. He wanted to find a way to get money to the Contras. And his intel community just took it upon themselves to deliver this happiness to the president. And I mean, everyone directly involved, kind of says that, right? That he really didn't know what was going on. I mean, his staff, his cabinet, the account in the book describes that when he was told exactly what was going on, because at first he denied everything because he didn't know. When he was told what was going on, he basically turned white. Like, all the blood drained out of his face. Now, normally his complexion was kind of ruddy. I mean, he had these naturally glowing red cheeks. But he just went, like, white. And then he realized just how deep in the shit he was. Because he had just told the nation that, no, this never happened. And it did happen. And so his own credibility was right out the door at that point. Now, to try and get his credibility back, and this is to his absolute credit, he authorized the Tower Commission to go in and investigate, and everyone but Poindexter and North were entirely forthcoming. I think North ultimately did agree to testify if he was granted immunity. And that testimony was eventually used to convict him, and that conviction was overturned because they used that testimony that he had been granted immunity for. So, like, no, you can't promise him immunity and then later try and convict him using that same testimony for which he was granted immunity. So, yeah, he's now...
And a novelist, and now he's on Fox News.
Well, he's an author and he's on Fox News, according to American Dad, which I think is accurate. Everybody, his chiefs of staff, his White House staff, they were all interviewed, including Reagan. Ultimately, Reagan just ended up saying, I don't know. I don't remember when asked specific questions. Now, there are some who might think this was the start of the Alzheimer's, and that eventually does set in, and we're going to come back to that. I don't think it was. Most likely it was a combination of, like, the reason he was able to get away with saying, I don't know, I don't remember, is most likely it was a combination of respect for the man himself and an acknowledgement that on any given day, the sitting president is one of the busiest people on planet Earth, right? So they let his I don't knows and I don't remember stand because as the busiest man on Earth, how likely is he to actually remember any given day? Now, following Iran-Contra, Reagan had nothing left to do but talk to the Soviets. In June of '87, he made his famous speech in Berlin at the Brandenburger Tor telling Gorbachev to tear down this wall, which brought the Soviets back to the table, and in November of '87, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was created, was signed by Gorbachev in '87. It was then ratified by the Senate in '88. And in November of '88, Reagan was gratified when the nation voted George H.W. Bush into office. And basically saw that as a positive referendum on his own presidency, that they accepted his vice president so readily, and he stepped down January 20th, 1987. Now, this book covers everything, and I could go on and on and on. It mentions, of course, the TWA hijacking, the bombing of Libya, invasion of Grenada, the war on drugs, the AIDS epidemic, the Challenger explosion. Now that I definitely remember because I was one of those kids sitting in the classroom watching it blow up live on television. And I remember asking my mom, who volunteered at our school, if she would have gone to space if offered, and being scared to death when she said yes. I mean, I had literally just seen a space shuttle explode live on television. But I get my mom's point. Like, you know, as an adult, I do. At the time, I was like, oh my God, my mom's going to, you know, kill herself. She's going to run off to NASA and they're going to explode her. But now it's like, I mean, that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. With no reason to suspect the tragedy that would happen. So I get it, you know. Given a once-in-a-lifetime chance, you take it, man. Now, about 6 months after he left the presidency, Reagan was riding horses with friends when his horse bucked him off and he hit his head. Nancy believed, and her doctors agreed, and I kind of agreed too, that this incident may have actually caused Reagan to develop Alzheimer's. And I Googled it because I was like, really? Can traumatic brain injury contribute to Alzheimer's? And it can, actually, according to Google. It can trigger it. And once the downhill slide starts, away you go. And it's kind of ironic that Nancy had a war on drugs, since we now know that LSD and psilocybin can help heal traumatic brain injury. So there's a great deal of irony there. So, anyways, he was still giving speeches, he was traveling, but Nancy began to notice a definite decline. And she finally mentioned it to the doctors during his annual physical in August of 1994. And he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and Nancy made the announcement to the nation that he had to withdraw from public life for what remained of his health. The reason I believe that he didn't develop the Alzheimer's until after his presidency is the descriptions of what was going on during his presidency. He was very much in the public eye. I mean, it would have been obvious. I mean, think about how obvious it is that our current president is having problems. I mean, it's obvious. And I think that it would have been even more so with President Reagan, because he was very much a public eye person. I mean, he'd been in the public eye his whole life. He'd been an actor. So it would have, that sort of cognitive decline would have been visible and obvious. And I think if he had the severe cognitive declines as exhibited by Alzheimer's patients, I don't think he would have been capable of engaging in the hours-long arms reduction talks that he had with Gorbachev. Somebody would have said something. And this isn't a Woodrow Wilson situation, is what I'm saying. The world communications have truly been global since the 1980s, and they wouldn't have been able to pull it off. Anyways, Reagan had already done the responsible thing once before. This is kind of my final point of why he didn't have the Alzheimer's when he was still in office. Because in March of '85, he had a routine surgery to remove a polyp. Now, he was only expected to be out for about 10 days, and he still activated the 25th Amendment, which temporarily transferred power to the Vice President Bush so that Reagan could just rest and heal. Now, if he was aware, I think that if he knew he was experiencing cognitive declines, if that was a thing, Congress would have forced the issue, because by his second term, especially by 1986, he'd lost both the House and the Senate to the Democrats. They would have made him step down at that point. I think Nancy was right. I think that it was this head injury that facilitated the Alzheimer's, led to his decline. I think if he hadn't fallen off the horse and hit his head, he might have retained his faculties up until his death, which was on June 5th, 2004. I really enjoyed this book. I mean, it was well organized. It was well written. It does not leap back and forth as much as my review kind of did, but all the pieces are laid out in a more or less concise timeline. So much so that when he first mentioned the Contras in like 81, when he was talking about the 1981 year, I was like, okay, here's where it starts. And I need to put a tab down because I'm like, this is where it starts. And as a kid in the 80s, I was only peripherally aware of the crazy goings on, but reading about how close we actually came, I mean, my God, the Korean Airlines thing alone probably brought us closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis to escalating from a Cold War to a hot war. Like, that was the next closest thing. The Cuban Missile Crisis almost brought us to a hot war. Korean Airlines almost exploded us, man. We came very close, I think. And it's only because Reagan chose to accept the Soviets' claim that it was an accident that it stayed cold, and eventually de-escalated to the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989. And then the USSR, of course, voted to dissolve itself December 26, 1991. And, I mean, both of those events can arguably be placed at the feet of the great communicator. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next Sunday. Bye.